Hi everybody, I'm going to talk to you today about, did astronauts really go to the moon back in the 70s, yes or no? Now, I asked the Great White Brotherhood about this and they gave me all this, which I'll read to you. But may I first say that we have a site called www.thegreatwhitebrotherhood, or one word, .org, in addition to what you can see behind me, and you'll find masses of information on that site, including the written out, the printed out version of what I've got here. So if you want to go and read it for yourself, you can, okay? But now, I remember long ago, back in the 70s, President Kennedy saying to us that he wanted to send a man to the moon before the end of that decade. And if he said it, we believed him. And why he wanted to send a man to the moon, I'm not too sure. It may have been to try and beat the Russians there, because they were in the space race as well. But anyway, he said that he would try and get a man to the moon within that decade, the 1970s. And this is what this is all about. Did they really go there or didn't they? Now, I'm going to read it to you now. This is a delicate subject to talk about because the story is much more complicated than has been presented. And this, by the way, comes from the Great White Brotherhood, as usual. At the time that President Kennedy announced his intention to put man on the moon, he knew perfectly well that it would be quite impossible using conventional rocket technology that was available at that time. However, he had been informed that what is called the Secret Space Program, also called the SSP, had for a long time been in contact with alien beings who had been using the moon as a base for a considerable length of time. So, to appear to be in advance of other nations in this race to be first to go to the moon, President Kennedy also had to be briefed about this alien technology that existed. And a lot of presidents are not briefed about it, but he was. So a plan was hatched to appear to send man to the moon using conventional rocket technology, but actually using alien technology to achieve that goal. Equally, in case anything went terribly wrong and to avoid having to admit to failure, a setup was created in a film studio, and before any attempt to send an astronaut out into space, a complete film was created so that success was assured. It was assumed that no one would question what was shown on TV, as it looked fairly convincing. Now, of course, people are starting to see through the filmed illusion, but at the time it was accepted as true. And certainly when I watched it all live and direct on my little black and white television set, I didn't question it. I thought that, for instance, when somebody jumped down from the landing module so-called on the moon and said, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind, I never said, hold on, who's outside already filming the man jumping down? We didn't question any of that. We just watched it with our mouths open. Anyway, now, to return to the actual visit to the moon. As was said, it was quite impossible for man, at the level of advancement that he was at the time, to get to the moon, so a plan was hatched with an alien race to have the astronauts taken to the moon using a UFO, a flying saucer. So indeed, the astronauts, or some of them, were taken to the moon to conduct certain scientific experiments. So when Buzz Aldrin and co were asked, did you go to the moon? And they said, yes, they were telling the truth. The question that wasn't asked of them was, did you go in Apollo 11 or 12 or whatever? Because if they'd have said yes to that, that would not have been true. But certainly they did go to the moon, but in a flying saucer, which I think is amazing. They only stayed a few hours because they were made unwelcome by reptilians who followed their every move. So humans were taken to the moon. They collected a few rocks as evidence of their journey, and then they returned to Earth. Virtually all the film that was shown on TV came from the film produced on Earth, either in the studio or sometimes I believe it was filmed outside in desert regions and so on, Arizona and goodness knows where. Eventually, because of the extremes of hot and cold on the moon and other atmospheric anomalies, the cameras and photographic film used in them would not have functioned, as NASA already knew. Now, that is not to say that perhaps from a window in the flying saucer, certain bits of film, certain photographs were taken. But certainly none of it was actually connected to the rocket, which stayed in Earth orbit somewhere. So the answer to the question is yes, some astronauts went to the moon, but in a UFO. They stayed a few hours and returned in the same UFO. But what people have seen of the visit was created and filmed on Earth. As one can imagine, the enormity of the lie had a profound effect on some of the astronauts. They went through a period of mind control that implanted false memories in their minds, which added to the confusion. And then it just says at the end here, however, it is perhaps time that the truth concerning this moon event was revealed to the public. Now, I don't know if you saw the interview that 3 astronauts gave. 3 of them sat behind a desk, and it was a press conference, I believe, and they were asked questions. Could they see stars and all? And you could see that they were clearly distressed people. Instead of being all happy and joyous that they went to the moon, they sat there with their faces kind of blank and miserable looking, and there was a clear conflict going on in their minds between what they'd been programmed to say and what memories they had of their actual visit in a flying saucer. Anyway, I went on to ask some further questions. For instance, how did the monitoring system in the control room work? You remember all the people that were sat behind screens, dozens and dozens of them? I didn't know if they were part of the illusion or what. Anyway, this is the answer. The monitoring system was surprisingly simple. The technicians who thought they were monitoring the progress of the astronauts and the spacecraft were not sat in front of computer screens as one would use today. They were in front of small television sets. Virtually all of these television sets were connected to a large bank of video recorders that were playing back film or tape that had already been recorded, presumably on the VHS system, which maybe we hadn't got, but no doubt NASA had already got. There were a sufficient number of these cassettes to last the length of the supposed journey, both to the moon, on the moon, and the return journey. Obviously, as the cassettes were playing, putting information from the cassettes onto the television sets, the technicians watched and hopefully believed what they were observing. Most of these technicians had no means of interacting with the information being played. Their role was just to observe. So all the technical details had all been worked out in advance and put onto tape, and the poor guys were just sat there watching tapes playing. It's incredible, isn't it? Most of the cassette players were in pairs, As one cassette came to an end, the second cassette started, thus ensuring continuity of transmission. Thus it was that very few people were actually aware of the hoax. That's pretty cool, don't you think? Anyway, the last question is, which alien group was involved in the deception? The answer is, this alien group was in fact those that are referred to as the Nordics or tall whites. They're the same group, just a different name for the same group. The very same group that was supposedly involved with the development of the Apollo space rockets. Now, what that's talking about is a gentleman that's very elderly now that was more or less in charge of trying to solve problems with the Apollo system. And he had with him 2 secretaries. Now, these secretaries, 2 ladies, were in fact Nordics or tall whites. And they had very advanced knowledge, and so they were feeding to this gentleman answers to the problems that the Apollo team had of how to make the rocket work and all the air conditioning and goodness knows what to make the whole thing look as if it was feasible. Right, and it just finishes with this. The ones helping the human technicians resolve the problems were there quite simply to ensure that the project looked feasible, as I just said. In exchange for their help, they were given access, the tall whites, the Nordics, were given access to land on the surface of the Earth and any buildings they required. In fact, any help they wanted in any domain. And that's what I've got. That's the end of it. Now, make of this what you will. Some of you might believe it. Some of you think it's nonsense. It's up to you. I've told you what I was told, and you either believe it or not. I will just mention once again, as I said at the beginning, if you want actually to read this for yourself, you can go onto our site www.thegreatwhitebrotherhood, all one word, .org, and you'll find there masses of information that you can read on all sorts of subjects, including a transcript of this. Okay, now, thank you very much for listening to me, and as always, any questions, I'll be glad to help if I possibly can, and I'll speak to you another day about another topic. Okay, bye.